It is the perfect target. 500 potential victims.
Airplanes are uniquely vulnerable to terrorists.
All it takes is a bomb on board.
I've lost my brother-in-law, sister-in-law, and their house is just a 30-foot crater.
We explore the terrible game of cat and mouse between terrorists and airlines. How security failures lead to a bomb going into the hold. How a cool-headed Al-Qaeda killer slips a new device past airport scanners. And how a man attempts to blow up an American airliner. But do we now have the technology, the inside information to counter the threats? Or will the terrorist always get through? On Christmas Day, 279 passengers are flying from Holland to the United States. Among them is a young Nigerian man, Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalab. He seems unremarkable. Also on board is Dutch filmmaker Jasper Scheringa. Everything seems like a normal flight. The plane is just 20 minutes from landing at Detroit. Then,
some people started to scream, "Fire, fire!" At that moment, I was like, "Oh my God, this is wrong." And without hesitation, I don't know, I just made myself over there, jumped over some people, grabbed him by his neck just to make sure, because we didn't know if he had any other explosives.
It's a lucky escape for Scheringa and his fellow passengers. Abdul Muttalab is an Al-Qaeda suicide bomber. If the explosives he'd smuggled on board had detonated, they might have blown a hole in the side of the plane. Security authorities now face two difficult questions. How has a man with known links to Islamic extremists been allowed to board the plane? And how, 8 years after 9/11, is he able to smuggle a bomb on board? What is even more alarming is that this attack should never have happened, if lessons had been learned from the past. Airlines haven't always worried about bombs on board planes. In the 70s, their great fear was hijackers. What happened at Dawson's Field in Jordan shocked the world. A handful of Palestinian terrorists hijacked 4 airliners. They wanted to make headline news. Having released the passengers, they blew up 3 of the planes. Back then, hijackers rarely killed their hostages. They preferred to keep them alive for bargaining purposes. Their weapons were chiefly used to take over the planes. The security response was to try to prevent those guns getting on board. From 1973, passengers in America have to walk through the now familiar metal detector arch for the first time. Norman Shanks, one of the world's top experts on aviation security.
Dawson's Field was primarily responsible for the measures you see today, which is basic passenger screening for weapons, whether they're knives, sharp instruments, or guns.
And it worked. The threat of hijacking was contained, at least for now. But closing one loophole just forces the terrorists to look for another. No one is ready for the next threat on the horizon. In 1985, terrorists are preparing to unleash a sinister new device. On the morning of the 23rd of June, Air India Flight 182 is making its way from Canada across the Atlantic towards London, the first leg of a journey to India. Dr. Bal Gupta's wife is on board the flight.
That was our periodic trip to India to meet the friends and relations. And we couldn't get all the tickets for the whole family, so she was going 2 weeks earlier.
As the plane approaches Ireland, the pilots make contact with air traffic control.
Air India 182, good morning.
Air India 182, good morning, score 2005, and go ahead, please.
Then at 7:14, the Air India radar return mysteriously vanishes from the screen. There is no warning, no Mayday call. It simply disappears. By 9:30 that morning, the fate of Flight 182 is discovered just off the Irish coast. The plane has blown apart in mid-air. All 329 people on board are dead.
I woke up my boys. One was 18, other was 12 at that time. And we have a place of worship downstairs in the basement, so I took them down and we just sat down in prayer.
When investigators retrieve the tapes from the plane's black boxes, they reveal a chilling story. A sudden loss of electrical power. The classic signature of a bomb going off on board. Chris Yates is an expert on international terrorism and aviation security.
The Air India 182 disaster was really a defining moment for the aviation security industry. Although we didn't know at the time why that 747 simply fell out of the sky, we had a fairly good idea that quite probably we were talking about an explosive device going off on that plane at that time.
But who has planted a bomb? And how has it got on board? The shattered remains of Air India 182 are now the starting point for a murder investigation.
From Canada.
As the police sift through the passenger lists and booking records, evidence begins to point towards one particular terrorist threat. Extremist members of the Indian Sikh religion. The previous year, the Indian Army had stormed the Golden Temple in Amritsar, trying to suppress extremists fighting for a separate Sikh state. The sacrilegious bloodbath at the Sikhs' holiest of shrines triggers a desire for revenge. Canada has one of the largest Sikh populations outside India. Because of this, security measures at Canadian airports are tightened up. But now, the authorities realize their defenses have been pointing in the wrong direction.
The measures in place at the time were really not geared to identify bombs in checked baggage. The technology at the time was frankly not capable. And it was quite easy for passengers not to board the aircraft having checked a bag in.
Security experts investigate how the terrorists got through. They focus on a particular process in baggage handling, known as interline. When you fly from one country to another, you often check in at your start and then maybe change planes somewhere else. Using the interline system, your baggage gets transferred from one flight to another without you needing to see it again until you reach your final destination.
The terrorists can exploit the interline system as it was in place at the time simply by checking a bag in, flying on that first sector, and then just not turning up for the future sectors.
In other words, the bomb in the bag is put on board, but the terrorist never gets on. This is what investigators believe happened. A passenger calling himself M. Singh is booked to fly out from Vancouver to Toronto and waitlisted for the onward flight, Air India 182. He persuades the check-in agent to book his bags all the way through to India on the interline system. But he never gets on board. Once the bomb is in the hold, it is simply a question of timing when it will go off. Indian investigators know this is a wake-up call for airline security. But in many parts of the world, the wake-up call goes unheeded. Yotam Margalit is an expert on explosives detection systems.
Security systems were still primarily focused on finding the type of threats which a passenger would carry on his body in order to hijack the plane. And this case of the Air India attack in 1985 is a prime example of the fact that we take a long time to develop effective security means that are capable of true certifiable threat detection.
If the lessons had been learned from Air India 182, they might have prevented one of the world's most shocking terrorist attacks of modern times. Just 3 years later, Pan Am Flight 103 takes off from Heathrow just 4 days before Christmas. It is blown to pieces over Lockerbie in Scotland. 270 people are killed, including 11 on the ground.
As far as I know, I've lost my brother-in-law, my sister-in-law, and their house is just, there's just a 30-foot crater where their house was. Like, I can't even find the house. It's gone, like.
As a member of a rescue organisation, unfortunately, attended many fatalities, but never anything like the scale of that in one place. It really was quite difficult at times to cope with it.
What follows is the biggest forensic investigation in history.
the aircraft and its components, and baggage and items from it were just spread over such a vast area. So we picked up an immense amount of aircraft parts and personal effects, and they were the things that finally bore the evidence that proved what had brought the aircraft down.
As the forensic team begin to investigate, the evidence leads them to the same weak spot exploited by Sikh extremists 3 years before. Pan Am 103 has been blown apart by an unaccompanied bomb hidden in a bag in the hold. Investigators believe in Malta, a Libyan terrorist team led by Abdelbaset Ali al-Magrahi placed a suitcase containing explosives onto a plane bound for Frankfurt. The bag, they think, was checked through to New York on Flight 103. But the men responsible never boarded the plane in Malta. Once again, an unaccompanied bag with a bomb inside is traveling through the interline system. At Frankfurt Airport, the bag is simply allowed to be forwarded onto the Pan Am flight, with devastating results. In the aftermath of the Lockerbie disaster, security authorities tried to strengthen their defenses to keep passengers safe. Could planes be made tough enough to survive a bomb blast? That means lining it with bomb-proof material, making it both heavier and more expensive. The conclusion is, you can't build a tank that will fly. Airplanes would always be vulnerable to a bomb on board. Security experts now look for a way to stop bombs getting into the hold. Their solution, first developed at Heathrow Airport, is to screen every single bag after it's been checked in. The key technology that made this possible is computerized tomography, or CT.
CT is an X-ray-based technology where the source that produces the X-rays and the detector that collects them continuously spin around the bag. This generates a tremendous amount of data about the individual objects that are inside the bag, and it's actually measuring density. Explosives have a specific range of densities that they're found in, and that's how we detect them.
If the scanner picks out a suspicious object, airport security can investigate further with the passenger. But closing one loophole only forces terrorists to think again. If they can't put a bomb in the hold, can they now get one into the passenger cabin? The city of Manila in the Philippines. An unlikely spot for a new international terrorist campaign. Thousands of passengers fly on holiday and business trips between the Philippines and the United States. None of them suspect they are the targets of a man with a horrifying ambition. Ramzi Yusuf, a highly trained al-Qaeda terrorist, has hatched a plot known as Boyinka. The target, over 4,000 passengers on 12 planes, flying between Asia and the USA. Christine Negroni has written extensively on security issues.
Ramzi Yusuf was planning an enormous terrorist event, the likes of which we've never seen, perhaps eclipsing 9/11, in that 12 US airliners were going to be bombed simultaneously as they flew across the Pacific.
Yusuf isn't going to risk a suitcase bomb that might be detected by the X-ray scanners. he is going to take the bomb on board himself. And that means getting it past airport security. So he comes up with an ingenious terrorist solution, the micro bomb. Danny Kay is one of Britain's top explosives experts.
Ramzi Youssef used a range of household objects. For example, the power source was an ordinary 9-volt battery. The timing device, a simple digital watch available from any high street shop. The explosives were ignited using exposed filaments of an electric light bulb. The liquid explosive that he used was concealed in a contact lens cleaner solution bottle.
The ordinary-looking liquid is actually nitroglycerin.
Nitroglycerin as an explosive is an extremely sensitive material, very, very sensitive to shock. Even experienced scientists and chemists have had accidents handling it, so Youssef was really gambling with his own life when he was messing around with this stuff.
Each of Youssef's carefully chosen components appears harmless on their own. Only the detonator wires might raise suspicions. Youssef has to get them past the metal detectors, but he finds a loophole in security. Metal detectors are set up to identify guns or knives, usually hidden on the upper body or legs. So Youssef hides his thin metal wires inside his shoes. But before he's ready to launch the Bayinka attack, he needs to test his lethal microbomb. So in December 1994, Youssef decides he's ready for a trial run. First, he has to get past the scanners at Manila Airport. It goes without a hitch. Youssef's target is Flight 434 from Manila to Tokyo. It makes a convenient stop at the city of Cebu, where Youssef can disembark after planting his bomb. This is not a suicide mission. Youssef has booked himself seat number 26K. His research tells him it is directly above the center wing fuel tank. Once the plane is airborne, Youssef discreetly prepares his bomb. He sets the timer for 4 hours ahead. Then he returns to seat number 26K. He hides the bomb in the life jacket pouch underneath his seat. When the plane lands at Cebu, Youssef calmly disembarks. A young Japanese passenger, Haruki Ikegami, now comes on board for the final stage to Tokyo. He sits down in seat 26K, directly above the bomb. Haruki Ikegami is killed instantly, cut into two at the waist. 10 other passengers are wounded. Incredibly, Flight 434 survives. Yusuf's plot has one flaw. The plane is another version of the 747 with a different seating layout. Seat 26K is 2 rows away from the center wing fuel tank, so Yusuf's microbomb fails to ignite it. Soon after, Yusuf's bomb factory is discovered, and Yusuf himself is arrested after a tip-off. 18 months later, he's convicted and jailed for life.
The defendants convicted today, if they had had their way, would have killed within 48 hours literally thousands of innocent, unsuspecting passengers headed to America in a dozen different jumbo jets. The horror of it is almost impossible to comprehend.
Yusuf is now behind bars, but he has shown microbombs can pass unnoticed through baggage screening. Explosive substances can be disguised as harmless liquids. And metal detectors are not set off by wiring hidden in the heels of shoes. Despite this, none of the authorities recognize the potential threat.
What I still find remarkable is that even after he was found, and he was arrested by the police for, starting a fire in his apartment as he tested, some sort of explosive mix, what I still find amazing about that is that we didn't take him seriously.
Yusuf's plot should have been a massive wake-up call for aviation security. But again, no one hears it. Al-Qaeda's next attack comes out of the blue. "9/11 shocks the world. It brings home the global scale of the terrorist threat. This time, there is no need for bombs on board. Passenger planes are turned into lethal guided missiles. Hijacking is back, but on a devastating new scale. "19 Al-Qaeda terrorists show the world there's a new kind of hijacker to fear. One prepared to give his own life for a cause."
9/11 in some ways took us full circle. We started with the threat from hijacking, and we've gone back to a threat from hijacking, but with an entirely different dimension to it. Yes, it was a hijack, but it was a suicide hijack.
Nothing in aviation security can be the same after 9/11. The US government tries to establish what has gone wrong. One of the first things they realize is that the Al-Qaeda terrorists haven't even broken security rules. Their weapons were permitted on board.
One of the quite remarkable aspects of 9/11 is, of course, the fact that travelers were allowed to take knives on board aircraft, whatever that knife might be, from a box cutter right through to some that could fairly be described as weapons. And for that reason, no, the hijackers didn't contravene any of the rules and regulations.
Things clearly have to change. On the ground, all dangerous items are banned from hand luggage. In the air, cockpit doors are made bulletproof and locked from the inside.
The risk to taking over an aircraft has been totally reduced by simply locking and closing cockpit doors.
These measures seem to be effective. But the terrorists change tactics once more. Gone are the suicide hijackers, in come the suicide bombers. Richard Reed is a petty criminal born in Britain, where he is exposed to radical Islamic extremists. After being trained in an Al-Qaeda terrorist camp in Afghanistan, his terrorist minders give him a very special pair of shoes to wear.
The main explosive in the shoe, contained within the area under the arch of the foot and the heel, was a plastic explosive known as C4, a very powerful military explosive. The lace was impregnated with a homemade explosive known as TATP, or colloquially known as the Mother of Satan. There have been a number of documented instances of bomb makers actually blowing themselves to pieces trying to make TATP. It is such a volatile explosive to manufacture. Reed's intention was to ignite the stub end of the lace and allow it to progressively burn down. As it burned down, it would burn faster, eventually detonating and setting off the bulk of the explosive charge contained within the sole and the heel.
Just 4 days before Christmas, Reed arrives at Charles de Gaulle Airport outside Paris. His target is an American Airlines flight to Miami. But his disheveled appearance and one-way ticket raise suspicions. He is held for questioning by the police. But they don't check his shoes. Next day, he is allowed to board the flight to Miami, still wearing his shoe bomb. Reed waits until the plane is well on its way across the Atlantic. And his fellow passengers are relaxing after a meal break. Then, he tries to set light to his shoelace, coated with the lethal Mother of Satan explosive. At first, the flight attendant just thinks he's desperate for a cigarette. Reed tries again, the shoe bomb now on his lap. But the lace still fails to ignite. Suddenly, both flight attendants and passengers realize the danger. They finally manage to subdue the would-be suicide bomber. It is a lucky escape for Flight 63. This plane is carrying a replica of Reed's shoe bomb. And this is what could have happened. So why didn't it go off?
Well, we've got a segment of the boot that was actually projected some 50 or 60 meters away from the airframe. In reality, Richard Reed's co-passengers were extremely lucky. We know that he was held over on his flight for around about 24 hours in Paris. TATP, the homemade explosive that Reed had impregnated in his shoelace, absorbs moisture. This was the saving grace for his fellow passengers. Moisture absorption in that 24-hour period meant that Richard Reed could not ignite the shoelace.
In other words, all the passengers and crew of Flight 63 have been saved by Reed's delay in Paris and his sweaty feet. Richard Reed is soon heading for a future behind bars. But he's made the authorities think again. After 9/11, they targeted suicide hijackers, but now they have to stop suicide bombers getting on board. Metal detectors now routinely monitor passengers' feet. Shoes are inspected. So the terrorists look for another way past security. In 2006, airliners leaving the UK are to be the target for a multiple suicide attack. This time, the terrorists returned to Ramzi Yousef's idea from 12 years before. A microbomb using liquid explosives. Taking a sugary powder, then mixing it with an explosive liquid. Who would suspect a bottle of soft drink? And now they no longer need trick shoes or even wires. A disposable camera, an apparently harmless device, is to be the detonator. The plot is foiled just in time. All liquids over 100 milliliters are banned.
All passengers must be hand-searched, and their footwear and all items they are carrying must be X-ray screened. Any liquids discovered must be removed from the passenger. We will not be permitting bottled liquids and fluids.
It isn't popular with passengers, but the threat is real and can no longer be ignored. Even toys are deemed a potential risk. When instructions on making detonators out of toy remote controls appear on the internet, anyone carrying them on board is subjected to a full search. These measures are helpful, but the authorities know a determined suicide bomber will eventually find a way through.
It isn't rocket science. We should assume that these people are probing the system all of the time. By doing all of that sort of intelligence gathering, it's giving them a fairly good, sound idea on how to defeat this system.
Today, the US authorities recognize they can't anticipate every new method of attack. They have to gather intelligence on potential terrorists and stop them getting on board in the first place.
Names are quite evidently kept on lists. Those lists are categorized. The known individuals out there who may belong to some terrorist organization or some such.
There are about 550,000 names on a central database. Those posing a more definite threat are put on a no-fly list. This should flag up immediately if someone on the list tries to check in. Watch lists, checking your shoes, banning liquids, examining luggage in the hold. All of these measures have made air travel safer. But as the Christmas Day bomber shows, even these methods are fallible. In 2009, Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib was a young Nigerian with a problem. After spending several months in Yemen, where he allegedly came into contact with Al-Qaeda terrorists, he is now ready for martyrdom and wants to blow up an American airline. The question is, how can he get through the new, tighter security? First, he is given a new kind of microbomb, combining powdered explosives with a liquid detonator, small enough to be within the limit for liquids allowed on board.
Abdul Muttalib was trying to take advantage of a reaction known as a hypergolic reaction. He was going to inject a clear liquid into a powder, which after a few seconds will give a fireball. He wanted this fireball to detonate explosives concealed elsewhere on his body.
The fireball can reach a temperature over 2,000 degrees centigrade, easily hot enough to set off the bomb. As well as the liquid detonator, Abdul Muttalib is given a pouch of powdered explosive. It's sewn into his underwear to avoid detection. His suicide mission begins in Ghana in Africa, where he buys his one-way ticket to the USA. He then travels via Nigeria to Amsterdam's Schiphol airport. There he becomes just one of many passengers making their way to departures. But he still faces the final security checks before boarding Flight 253. With the high explosive in his underwear and carrying the liquid detonator, Abdul Muttalib makes his way to the gate. No one seems to think it's odd he has a one-way ticket, or he's going to a freezing cold Detroit, apparently without a coat. Once on board, he takes his seat by the window, behaving just like any ordinary passenger. The terrorists have learned their lesson. He's directly above the center wing fuel tank. Some 7 hours into the flight, the plane is starting its approach to Detroit Airport. The young would-be martyr has prepared himself. He is now ready to strike. He tries to inject the liquid into the powdered explosive, but it doesn't blow up as planned. Within minutes, he has been overpowered by Jasper Schuringer.
But this is a triumph for courageous passengers, not airport security.
Well, it's very scary, and I'm very lucky to be alive, and I think we're all very lucky to be alive.
When the investigation begins, what emerges is a catalogue of security errors.
This was not a failure to collect intelligence. It was a failure to integrate and understand the intelligence that we already had. The information was there. Agencies and analysts who needed it had access to it, and our professionals were trained to look for it and to bring it all together.
Just 2 months earlier, Abdul Muttalib's journey to Yemen was reported to the US Embassy in Nigeria by his own father, fearing his son has become a potentially dangerous extremist. American intelligence does not join the dots. Abdul Muttalib is never placed on the no-fly list.
We still have an awful long way to go in collecting intelligence on people and effectively disseminating that intelligence to those people who need to know, the people at the sharp end.
The second failure is that airport security is unable to detect the liquid and powder microbomb. In Britain, the political response led by former Prime Minister Gordon Brown is to bring in more sophisticated technology.
People will see gradually being brought in the use of full-body scanners. They will see checks for explosive traces. That will be done on hand luggage. Transit passengers will also be checked, as well as transfer passengers.
There are two types of full-body scanner. One sends radio waves over a person, producing a three-dimensional image by measuring the energy reflected back. The other type uses low-level X-rays to create a two-dimensional image of the body beneath the clothes. Both are designed to uncover what a physical pat-down could reveal, including guns or plastic explosives strapped to someone's body. At first sight,
it seems intrusive. The latest scanners produce anonymous images, focusing attention on the threat
rather than the person. They are now being introduced at airports around the world. But this technology is only the most visible of our anti-terrorist defenses.
Why are we taking off our shoes and throwing our laptops on the belt? Well, we're doing that as the last process for making sure we're safe. Not the first. The first is understanding who's on these airplanes, understanding who's likely to be causing a problem on an airplane.
Many believe the best way forward is to use passenger profiling. Potential threats are identified using intelligence sources or spotting suspicious behavior on the ground. For instance, the fact that Abdul Muttalib was traveling to Detroit at Christmas without a winter coat. And that both he and Richard Reed were on a one-way ticket should have triggered further investigation. Many airports are now employing behavior detection officers to spot people acting out of the ordinary.
It's a fairly straightforward technique. You can experience this yourself when you go through a customs channel. That you see customs officers there observing passengers as they're going through. And they're pretty good and have been good for a number of years at identifying people that may be carrying something through they perhaps shouldn't.
That still leaves the issue of liquid explosives. Now there are scanners on the way designed to counter even this threat. Potentially lethal liquids have unique chemical characteristics. Even if they're hidden in the most innocent-looking containers, this device can spot them by analyzing data from X-ray scanners.
Steve Buchan is an expert on airport security scanning.
Certain liquids have been designated as a threat, and what we do is we characterize the molecular structure of those particular threat items, and they are introduced into a library. So if a liquid passes through the system and the characteristics of that liquid matches those characteristics of some of those materials that are in the library, it will recognize the fact, therefore giving an automated alarm to the operator.
2 decades after Ramzi Yousef's nitroglycerin microbomb, aviation security is finally dealing with the liquid explosive threat. All European airports are now required to have scanners similar to these in place by 2013.
And should terrorists try again to get a bomb in the hold, potential threats can now be identified using 3D technology.
The operator can now swim in 3D inside the bag. He can literally go inside the bag, travel kind of over the umbrella, underneath the sweater, turn left at the toothpaste, and face the object that he needs to make a decision on, very up close and personal with very high resolution. And that's unprecedented. That didn't exist before.
It seems that air travel has become safer. But equally, terrorists are always probing the system, looking for ways in. The battle continues.
We have to be predictive. We have to think the unthinkable.
We must all remain vigilant. They train for 2 years. They're the lords of the skies.
We're now take off.
Request climb flight level 360.
And our lives are in their hands. Pilots. But what happens if a pilot doesn't know what he's doing?
It turned like this and nosedived into the ground.
The airplane hits the surface of the sea, everybody dies.
Pilot error has been responsible for some of the worst accidents in aircraft history.
Unfortunately, he didn't handle this particular situation correctly.
The fight to reduce pilot error has become one of the big challenges of aviation. Tens of millions of pounds are being thrown at the problem.
Airbus's philosophy was, we can make an airplane that's pilot-proof.
But in a bid to eliminate pilot error, have we gone too far? Could it be some of these developments may have actually caused disasters? Qantas is the safest airline in the world. Famously, none of its big jets has ever crashed. But in autumn 2008, that reputation is suddenly on the line. Qantas Flight 72 is travelling from Singapore to Perth. It's an Airbus A330, one of the most modern aircraft in the world. At the controls, the flight crew are equipped with the latest technology designed to make flying safer. But as the aircraft, packed with over 300 holidaymakers, nears the Australian coast, it suddenly performs a series of bizarre and dangerous maneuvers. First, it climbs 200 feet. Then, equally suddenly, it drops 650.
What's the plane doing? What's the plane doing?
In the cabin, there's chaos. Up in the cockpit, the pilots have no idea what's going on. The plane is acting entirely on its own. Then it happens again. Uncommanded by the pilots, the plane plunges another 400 feet. Minutes later, the horrified captain issues a Mayday distress call.
Mayday, 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 Qantas 72.
315 people's lives are on the line. Will the pilot be able to rescue the situation? Yet the irony is, the entire incident is due to a computer-controlled flying system designed to eliminate a common cause of air crashes: pilot error. Just how serious the problem of pilot error can be is brought home to the people of Britain in the winter of 1989. British Midland Flight 92 takes off on a routine flight to Belfast in Northern Ireland. On board are 118 passengers and 8 crew. The aircraft is one of Boeing's new 400 series 737s. In charge is 43-year-old Captain Kevin Hunt, one of British Midland's most experienced pilots. His first officer is 39-year-old David McClelland. The plane rapidly climbs to 28,000 feet. It's a normal takeoff. But then, 13 minutes into the flight, just as the aircraft is about to hit cruising altitude, there's a shock. The bang sends a wave of alarm through the cabin. Passengers frantically look around for an explanation. Hunt and McClelland immediately suspect one of the plane's 2 engines has blown up. The cockpit voice recorder picks up Hunt urgently asking which of the 2 engines is damaged.
Which one? Which one?
His first reaction is to turn to the aircraft's instruments. But the instruments that would tell him if an engine is malfunctioning, the so-called vibration instrumentation, is notoriously unreliable in 737s at the time. Pilots don't trust them. So when smoke appears in the cockpit, McClelland falls back on his general knowledge of the aircraft. This tells him the smoke must be coming through the air conditioning system, and this, in 737s, is powered by the right engine. The cockpit voice recorder now picks up McClelland making a clear decision.
It's the right one, it's definitely the right one.
Shutting down the right.
Hunt immediately shuts down the right-hand engine. The clunking and vibrations cease. Calm returns to the cabin. The passengers relax. But minutes later, there's another, even bigger bang. Once again, the plane is rocked by vibrations. Then everything goes eerily quiet. The second left-hand engine has died. Flight BM-92 has no power at all. Seconds later, the 400-ton aircraft smashes into the ground.
An airliner with 118 passengers on board has crashed on the M1 motorway in Leicestershire.
In Belfast, the flight's destination, anxious relatives wait at the airport for a plane that will never arrive. Initial signs suggest there won't be many survivors. Ed Trimble led the air crash investigation.
Mr. Trimble, BBC, can we talk to you? I'm sorry.
I think most investigators would have said that the chances of many surviving that would have been low. Clearly, the aircraft is flying at over 100 knots on the approach, and suddenly it's been brought to a halt very abruptly indeed, and therefore one would have anticipated the G-forces would have been really significant.
Amazingly, only 47 passengers die. 71 survive.
We were down on the ground with a crash, all the lights were out, and we seemed to be at an angle of about 45 with the vertical. And at that time, really, there were a few people moaning in the cabin saying, "Oh, my leg's hurt, somebody please help me, I think I've broken my leg."
The tailpiece that I was on actually appeared to break away and topple over, and at that stage I was left suspended upside down.
Survivors are taken to hospitals across the region. Among them is the aircraft's captain, Kevin Hunt. At first, he's hailed as a hero for at least bringing some people down alive.
Considering the trouble he was obviously in, I reckon he must have nursed that plane to get so close. He must have done a brilliant job.
But soon afterwards, questions start to be asked.
We were getting reports of ground witnesses who had seen and heard this aircraft on the approach. What we were being told was that the left engine was covered in fire. It was like looking into a furnace, someone said. So clearly, the left engine was in trouble during that approach.
This fire in the left-hand engine would have been the first bang the passengers heard. But that shouldn't have been fatal. The twin-engined plane can fly quite safely on one engine.
Clearly, that hadn't happened. So the question was, what's happened to the right engine?
The right engine is minutely inspected. Slowly, an awful truth dawns.
The full strip inspection of the right engine revealed that there were no problems with the right engine prior to the impact.
It's the right one, it's definitely the right one.
Shutting down the right.
And yet this right-hand engine is the one the crew had shut down. So why had the pilot turned off his only working engine? The investigation will now reveal a classic case of pilot error. The pilots simply weren't familiar with their aircraft. Hunt and McClelland, not trusting their instruments, had relied on their general knowledge of 737s. This told them the smoke must be coming from the right engine, and so they'd shut it down. What they didn't know was that the new 400 series 737 is different from its predecessors. The aircon is powered by both engines. The smoke and smell came from the damaged left engine, not the perfectly good right one. More poignantly, the vibration instruments on the 737-400 series that indicate whether an engine is malfunctioning are more reliable than on earlier models. These had relayed with absolute accuracy that it was the left engine that had gone wrong, but the pilots had ignored the evidence in front of their eyes. David Learmount is a pilot and aircraft journalist.
Both pilots had the vibration information in front of their eyes, and it was accurate. It was showing them where the problem was. But because they were used to flying on the 737-300, where the vibration instruments were not reliable, they disregarded the instruments altogether.
The investigation has revealed an alarming truth. Neither pilot knew enough about the aircraft they were flying. The crash was caused by pilot error. Hunt, far from being a hero, is sacked. But behind the crash lies a much bigger issue that is increasing the chances of pilot error. A deluge of new aircraft models starts appearing from the 1980s onwards.
It was a period of great development, a great change in the industry.
Captain Chris Clark is an airline pilot and flight trainer.
Pilots were faced with a significant number of differing equipment, even on the same type of aircraft.
It's a situation almost designed to foster pilot error. There are 20 versions of the Boeing 747 and about the same number of the Airbus A300 series. There are 9 variations of the Boeing 737 and several versions of the Airbus A320. Pilots are having increasing difficulty keeping up with the ever-changing models.
It could be a different set of flight instruments, or it could be a different flight management system computer.
Each new version is better and safer than its predecessor, or fills a particular niche in the competitive aircraft market. But Kegworth has dramatically shown the downside. Hunt and McClelland had almost no training on the new Boeing 737-400 series.
The airline had assumed that because these people were experienced on the 737-300, that they really only needed what they referred to as a differences course to go onto the 400.
Kegworth is a clear warning. Pilots need more systematic retraining if there are not to be further cases of pilot error.
Both regulatory authorities and airlines recognise that where there was a difference in the flight deck equipment, even if it be on the same model but was just a variation of that model, there was a clear need for some training.
To reduce pilot error, pilots now begin to spend more time in highly realistic, computer-controlled flight simulators. These can recreate almost any flight scenario, almost anywhere in the world. Pilots can quickly and efficiently learn about different aircraft. But despite the new training opportunities,
Tower from Midland 1, we've had an undercarriage collapse.
the airline industry doesn't fully learn the lessons from Kegworth. It's not just about having more training. The training has to be good, or there can be unexpected consequences, every bit as deadly. It will need another tragic accident for the industry to realise it must do even more. Autumn 2001. and an American Airlines flight takes off from New York's Kennedy Airport. Flight 587 is bound for the Dominican Republic. On board, many of the passengers are visiting family and friends. But almost immediately after takeoff, something goes wrong. Patrick Tuhig is a local Catholic priest.
I spotted this aircraft going over. I thought, looking back on it, that it was flying a bit low. It turned like this and nosedived into the ground. So then I said to myself, oh my God, this is very, very serious. And I remember thinking how beautiful that plane looked in the last seconds of its life, because the sun shining directly onto that aircraft before it hit the ground.
American 587 Heavy, I'm not receiving your transponder. American 587 Heavy, New York. American 587 Heavy, New York.
"265 people die immediately, including 5 on the ground. Christine Negroni is a journalist who's written extensively about the aircraft industry.
It was a dramatic event because it was only 2 months after 9/11, and so there were immediate concerns and eyewitness accounts and everything else, you know, that the plane had been the victim of a terrorist attack.
Why should a plane suddenly fall out of the sky and explode on the ground? So the general talk among people looking on was, gee, this must have been another bomb on that aircraft.
It's one of the worst accidents in American aviation history.
It was impossible to get really near the fire. It was so intense. If you saw the people in the immediate vicinity, they were stunned.
One of the victims is Jose Laura, a law student. His sister still finds it hard to talk about it.
It's really hard to live with this pain. Every time when I see my brother's picture, I don't even want to see my brother's picture because I don't want to think that he's not here with us no more. And it's really hard.
The man in charge of the crash investigation is Bob Benson. He immediately faces demands for instant answers. This is a very public disaster in a very public place.
There was a lot of pressure from the city of New York. The very first news conference we give, we always get the question, what happened here? What's the cause of this accident? And of course, we can never answer.
The hunt for answers is hampered by the sheer scale of the devastation. There is almost nothing left of the aircraft.
My initial thoughts are really about the magnitude of our job. A lot of times in these types of accidents, we get a lot of information out of the wreckage itself. But in this case, unfortunately, the fire was so complete, the aircraft was full of fuel when it hit the ground, that we had very few physical clues to look at.
But then they find one massive clue.
It had to do with the vertical stabilizer of the airplane that was floating in the bay over a mile away from the main impact point. It would be very strange if a terrorist simply blew the tail off of an airplane. And so we thought early on that we were probably up against something a little more complicated than a terrorist attack.
It is the case that the National Transportation Safety Board is the lead agency because all information we have currently is that this is an accident.
But if it is an accident, what caused it? Initially, suspicion falls on Airbus's revolutionary construction methods. Large parts of the aircraft are made from a new material known as carbon fiber composite.
Composite materials are a bit of the wave of the future. Strong, and as importantly, they're lightweight. And in the airplane business, weight equals money.
One of these carbon fiber components is the aircraft's tail and its attachment points. Had there been a massive failure in this revolutionary new construction material? The implications are horrific.
Alarm bells were set off. We worried a lot about the rest of the Airbus fleet, whether or not there were inherent weaknesses in other Airbuses.
If Airbus are building aircraft with flawed components, could hundreds more drop out of the sky?
So we spent a lot of time studying, testing the strength of these components and how good the design was.
They use an ultrasound scanner to test the material for hidden hairline cracks or weaknesses.
Unlike metal, the fractures and stresses can't be seen by the naked eye.
They re-examine the design. They examine other Airbuses. They can find nothing that explains why the tail should shear off.
Turned out to be pretty much of a red herring. The design was stronger than it was certified to be.
But if it isn't a structural fault, why has the plane's tail fallen off? In a hunt for other clues, Benson's team recreate the aircraft's last minutes. Their attention soon focuses on the aircraft's first officer, 34-year-old Sten Molin. The son of an airline pilot, Molin has been flying for 10 years, all of it with American Airlines.
American 587 Heavy, Kennedy ground, runway 31 left for departure. Taxi left on Bravo, full short of Juliet.
That day, as flight AA587 prepares to take off, Molin is at the controls.
Left Bravo, short Juliet, American 587 Heavy.
Just in front of him is a Japanese Airlines flight. As the Japanese flight climbs, its engines generate powerful vortexes of wind. They are known as wake vortexes.
Wake vortexes are very powerful miniature tornadoes that are created as an aircraft flies through the sky. One comes off each wingtip.
These vortexes can cause serious air turbulence.
If, for instance, a very small aircraft were following very closely behind a very large aircraft, the smaller aircraft can experience structural damage.
The effect of flying into wake turbulence would be the effect of falling into a food mixer. So the planes following need to keep their distance. Air traffic controllers know this. Every pilot is expected to know it because that's a lot of upset in the air.
American 587 Heavy, 1300, 9 runway 31 left, clear for takeoff.
1731 left, American 587 Heavy.
But could such a common phenomenon as wake turbulence really have upset Flight 587?
American 587 Heavy, call.
At the National Transportation Safety Board, Benson's team continue the search for answers. They examine the aircraft's battered flight data recorder for evidence. They turn the numeric data into an illustration of what happened. Gradually, they piece together Flight 587's final minutes, and it's all about pilot error. The cockpit voice recorder picks up the captain's voice.
A little wake turbulence, yeah?
Molin replies.
Yeah.
Then, to stabilize the plane, he'd stamped on the rudder controls. It's the standard procedure for stabilizing an aircraft in these circumstances. But the flight data recorder shows Molin had been particularly energetic. First, he'd forced the rudder sharply to the right, then to the left.
He operated them so aggressively that the rudder went to stop. In other words, as far right and as far left as it could go. 4 times in 7.5 seconds. Back and forth, bang, 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 bang.
The rapid movement creates huge stresses on the aircraft's structure. Eventually, they become just too great.
The first officer put loads on the vertical stabilizer that were twice the design loads that the thing was certified to take, and it ultimately failed.
The attaching points fracture. The tail shears off. And the plane smashes to earth. But how can a pilot break an aircraft by simply manipulating the rudder controls? It now emerges that Airbus has issued specific warnings against violently reversing the rudder. But American Airlines has never warned its pilots that this could lead to structural failure. Indeed, their training encourages pilots to use the rudder energetically.
Because of limitations on simulators and the teaching methods they were using, they were probably instilling in their pilots an unwanted desire to use the rudders aggressively when perhaps they shouldn't.
The conclusion is horribly clear. Over 250 people have died because of pilot error. Molin had simply not been properly trained to fly an Airbus. In the course of the investigation, other facts also emerge about Molin.
We found that he had a propensity for overreaction. He tended to overreact to situations such as wake turbulence, and unfortunately, he didn't handle this particular situation correctly.
But for many lay observers, there is another question. Why, at a very busy airport like JFK, where wake turbulence is a routine problem, was a junior officer with a reputation for overreacting in charge of the takeoff? It's a story that goes back, ironically, to an earlier attempt to reduce pilot error. London, Heathrow, 1972. Pilots that year, at what was then called British European Airways, are in the middle of a bitter and divisive pay dispute. Junior pilots are planning a strike. But many of the airline's older pilots are vehemently opposed to the idea. One of them is Captain Stanley Key, 4 years off retirement and anxious not to rock the boat. That afternoon, Key has a furious row with a younger, militant pilot.
Stanley Key's attitude was that strikes were a dereliction of duty. You had a duty to do, and one thing you did not do is fail in your duty, and your duty was to turn up to work, come what may.
Several hours after the row, Key is rostered on a routine flight to Brussels. With him, on BEA Flight 548, are co-pilot Jeremy Keeley and second officer Simon Ticehurst. As the aircraft climbs out of Heathrow, Key, at the controls, is said to be still fuming from the row. Suddenly, things go wrong. 2.5 minutes into the flight, the aircraft goes into a stall. It passes low over the densely populated town of Staines on the outskirts of London. Seconds later, it smashes into the ground. Almost immediately, sightseers clog the area. All 118 people on board are killed. It's Britain's worst ever air disaster. Within hours, air crash investigators arrive. As they pick through the rubble, they find something very puzzling.
The flight recorder we took away last night rather suggests that something went wrong with the leading edge droop around about 1,800 feet.
Droops are flaps on the front of a jet's wings that extend to provide vital extra lift at low speeds. A Trident must reach 3,000 feet and be flying at 225 knots before the droops can be safely retracted. But the flight data recorder shows that BEA Flight 548 was only flying at 1,800 feet at a speed of 162 knots when the droops were withdrawn. It's much too soon. The plane will have gone into an immediate stall. This was the first error, but it should not have been fatal. As the aircraft instruments sense a stall, an automatic emergency procedure kicks in. Chris Woods is a former Trident pilot and trainer.
The first thing that happens is a warning. This shakes the control column and basically saying to the captain, you are flying too slowly, push the stick forward, which will lower the nose of the aircraft and gather speed.
If the pilot still doesn't respond, a second emergency procedure kicks in.
A ram will push the stick all the way forward and hold it there until the speed has been recovered.
The plane will dive, the speed will pick up, and the stall should be averted. Yet the flight data recorder shows that somebody has overridden these alarms. Why? What had caused Stanley Key, an immensely experienced pilot, to make such a basic error? And why had neither of his crew stopped him? The investigators look at several possibilities. A post-mortem shows Key suffered heart problems.
He hadn't told anyone about them, but he did.
Could the violent row just before takeoff have triggered a sudden stroke? An even more surprising clue comes from a piece of the aircraft's debris. It's the cockpit table of one of the junior pilots. It's covered in anti-Key graffiti. One reads, "Key must go." Where? Down the drain. Another suggests, when Stanley Key dies, who will be God's next rep at BEA? Is this a clue to the real problem? Could the row over strike action have made Key's relationship with his young crew so bitter they simply weren't talking to each other? Had Keeley or Ticehurst expressed alarm and Key, the senior officer, simply ignored them?
In the hierarchical setup in that cockpit, challenging the captain was much more difficult than it is now.
We will never know if this is the truth. But the inquiry report is a trigger for important changes designed to reduce future pilot errors. From now on, it's the junior officer who flies the aircraft, particularly if conditions are difficult. This leaves the senior officer, the captain, free to watch for trouble and, if necessary, demand a new course of action.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lee Nevens and I'm the captain today. With me in the flight deck is First Officer Peter Nelamos, who will be flying you.
It's a safety routine that in the following years is widely adopted by airlines across the world. And it's why, nearly 30 years later, when American Airlines Flight 587 takes off from New York, nobody questions the fact that Sten Molin, the junior officer, is at the controls. By the early 2000s, the lessons of accidents like Kegworth and Queens have finally been driven home. Reports into both accidents recommend better training. More pilots now spend more time in ever more sophisticated simulators. But in the airline industry, there's also another, even more important development designed to eliminate pilot error: automation. The leader in the field is the European aircraft manufacturer Airbus. In the mid-1990s, Airbus launches the new A330 series. It's one of the first aircraft to make extensive use of the new digital technologies. It's so clever, it can almost fly itself.
Airbus's philosophy was, we can make an airplane that's pilot-proof, that will protect the airplane from the wrong decisions of pilots. And in effect, they have done that.
Martin Alder is an Airbus pilot.
To have a simple input control stick on the control column, just like your games computer.
This stick is like a mouse on a computer and takes instructions from the pilot. But the aircraft's autopilot also receives data from a mass of other inputs scattered through the plane.
Computers take information about the speed, the altitude, and central gravity of the airplane, and they add or subtract from the pilot's input to make sure the output that goes to the control surface on the wingtip is exactly what's required to do the job.
It means the controls are always trimmed to provide maximum efficiency. Flying becomes much less reliant on a pilot's skills.
Now, with the digital fly-by-wire, even a pilot of average ability would have no concerns about it.
Even more importantly, the software will override the pilot if he makes a mistake.
It limits the bank angles that the pilot can apply. It limits how far nose up the airplane can go, how far nose down, to make sure we don't fly too fast and damage the airplane, maneuver too abruptly and damage the airplane, or fly too slowly and lose control of the airplane.
The airplane won't let them do anything that might cause the airplane to crash.
Apart from takeoff, which still can't be fully automated, there is almost nothing a pilot need do except gaze at the ultra-modern liquid crystal displays. Pilot error is all but eliminated. Flying becomes much safer. Or does it? One of these super-automated aircraft is Qantas Flight 72 from Singapore to Perth. The plane has just made 3 dramatic changes of course without the pilots doing a thing. First, it's climbed. Then, it's dived. Many of the 300 passengers are in real trouble.
People were thrown around. They were thrown at the ceiling and then thrown at the floor. Computers were thrown around. Baggage, that flies around. A lot of people got severely injured.
Several have broken bones. Many others have been seriously battered and bruised. The pilots now frantically wrestle to seize back control. But for hours, they've been gazing at the screens and nothing's happening. It's lulled them into a false sense of security. It now takes valuable minutes to grasp what's going on.
When you have a failure, there is obviously a startle factor. We are human. And then we have to start taking in the information we've got and then decide from that what the appropriate response is.
If you wind up with an electronic glitch or a computer glitch in an automated cockpit, this is what pilots often say. What's the plane doing now?
What's the plane doing? What's the plane doing?
And that expression to me is so important because it really explains that there's sort of a disconnect between the plane and the person flying the plane. This process can cause a pilot to lose very precious time.
Finally, the pilots realize the aircraft's fabled computer control system is malfunctioning and switch it off. "40 minutes later, the plane makes an emergency landing in Western Australia. Everybody has survived. But it's been a close call. 53 people are hospitalized with injuries ranging from fractures to spinal damage. So what's happened on this nightmare flight? A later investigation reaches an unexpected and ironic conclusion. It's the very system designed to reduce pilot error that's caused the problem. The plane is equipped with sensors that automatically monitor the angle of flight. These appear to have sent corrupt data to computers controlling the autopilot. First, they tell the autopilot the plane is descending steeply. In fact, it's flying normally.
You've heard it about computers. If you tell them the wrong thing, they'll assume it's correct and they'll start acting accordingly.
The autopilot, thinking the aircraft is descending too rapidly, orders an ascent.
The computers were told that the aircraft's attitude was varying, and it wasn't. But they were trying to correct this.
Seconds later, the sensors change their mind and tell the autopilot to descend.
So the computers themselves weren't actually wrong. The sensors were.
The pilots have been left with no option but to turn off the autopilot. But how can a system designed to eliminate pilot error go so badly wrong? It's a question that will become increasingly pressing in the wake of a terrible accident in another part of the world. Rio de Janeiro. Air France flight 447 takes off on a scheduled flight to Paris. On board the Airbus A330-200 series are 216 passengers and 12 crew. The plane is carrying the latest automated technology designed to reduce pilot error. But then, 3.5 hours later over the Atlantic, it vanishes off the radar. Waiting families in Paris are distraught. Several days later, some of the wreckage is found floating in the sea.
The aeroplane hits the surface of the sea, everybody dies. So once we were up there, 30,000 feet plus, and then we're in the drink. So what happened?
Despite a huge search of the crash area, the flight data recorders are not found. It means investigators can only guess at what may have happened. But once again, suspicion falls on the aircraft's automated flying system. Just before the crash, onboard computers automatically relayed data to an Air France ground station. This shows speed sensors on the front of the plane were giving conflicting readings about the speed of the aircraft. It would have immediately puzzled the pilots. It's now, experts believe, they committed a cardinal error. They became so concerned about the problem, they lost sight of what the aircraft was really doing.
I think this has got a lot to do with the fact that this was at 2 o'clock in the morning. The pilots were fixated on solving the problem. What's going on here? What's making these two indicators tell me lies? And in the meanwhile, the airplane starts descending. The pilots simply had lost their appreciation of what the airplane was doing. They must have done.
While the search for the remains of the aircraft continues, we'll never be sure if this is what happened. But once again, vital components in the automated flying system seem to have failed. This distracted the pilots, who forgot to fly the plane. The Qantas and Air France incidents have opened a new controversy. Could it be that the new and clever systems designed to reduce pilot error are in fact causing errors themselves?
Whenever you introduce clever machinery to get over a known problem, you are introducing a new problem. All you really can do is to make absolutely certain that you are making things better than they used to be.
Today, modern cockpits are better equipped and designed to assist the pilot than ever before. Training is more regular and rigorous. Pilot error should be on the wane. Flying has never been safer. But the irony is that in trying to eliminate pilot error, we've introduced a whole new series of unexpected problems. They are the most deadly accidents in aviation.
I just knew that the plane had crashed.
We have invested millions in avoiding them.
Anything can happen anytime to anybody in a blink of an eye.
Aircraft collisions. We show how a misunderstanding causes the world's worst aircraft disaster. How a crash over Los Angeles leads to new technology that should have made flying safer. How technology meant to avoid collisions leads to a tragic mistake, causing a grieving father to commit murder. Because every time we attempt to solve the problem, we seem to unearth another. Sometimes the solutions even create whole new problems.
He went up into the air, exploded, and hit 1,500 feet down past us.
How can we stop planes colliding? Los Angeles International Airport. LAX is one of the busiest in the world. It's a beautiful day, and the sky over LA is unusually busy. Among the planes is a light aircraft belonging to William Kramer. Another is Aero Mexico Flight 498 from Mexico City. As the Aero Mexico flight enters LAX airspace, so mistakenly does the Kramer's light aircraft. At 11:52, a shudder passes through the Aero Mexico plane. Almost immediately, it goes into a nosedive. This picture is taken at the time. The pilots fight for control, but unbeknownst to them, they've collided with Kramer's plane. Their aircraft has lost its tailplane. It lands in the suburb of Cerritos. Gary Durian is one of the first firefighters on the scene.
A whole block that's right in front of me here was basically engulfed with flame. It was hard to tell that there was actually a house there. You could see maybe some remnants of a car in the main impact area.
In the aftermath, the aviation industry has to face one big question. How, on a clear day with perfect visibility, can two planes collide? If you can't rely on pilots seeing each other, how can you ever avoid collisions? The battle to stop planes colliding is littered with lessons half-learnt or technological solutions designed to solve one problem that have sometimes unwittingly led to another. As a result, there have been a series of terrible disasters. The story begins 10 years earlier, over the skies in Europe. As BA Flight 476 leaves London for Istanbul, the horror of mid-air collisions is about to be brought home to the people of Britain. On board the half-empty flight are 54 passengers. Several hours later, the aircraft enters Yugoslav airspace. At about the same time, coming in the opposite direction, is a DC-9 charter flight, Adria 550. It's taking 108 holidaymakers home to Germany. Both planes are due to come under the command of air traffic controllers in Zagreb at about the same time. The sky over the Croatian city is one of the busiest in Europe. To prevent collisions, the airspace is divided into 3 different sectors by altitude. The lower sector is below 25,000 feet. The middle sector is from 25,000 to 31,000 feet. And the upper sector is above 31,000 feet. Each sector is handled by a different controller. It's absolutely crucial that when an aircraft moves from one sector to another, both controllers understand exactly what's going on. That day, as the BA and Adria flights near each other, the Zagreb controllers are pushed to their limits. Mladen Hochberger was an upper sector controller at the time. He remembers the job could be very demanding.
There were times when, because of the state of our equipment, we couldn't do our job properly.
On the BA flight, by contrast, all is calm. The first officer is even doing a crossword.
4 across, healthier, 5 letters.
As the aircraft approaches Zagreb at a cruising altitude of 33,500 feet, the pilot radios its position.
476 is Klagenfurt 02, 330, estimating Zagreb at 14.
The call is taken by 28-year-old Gradimir Tasic, the man responsible for the upper sector at that time. He's working his third consecutive 12-hour day. Bob Trott is an air traffic controller and trainer.
Working 3 days in a row and 12-hour shifts in each day with no break for 3 hours or so would make things pretty intolerable. There are multiple tasks. You're listening to the radio, you're looking at the radar display, you're writing on flight progress strips, you may be inputting data into computer.
Tasic acknowledges the BA call and moves on to another aircraft. But at about the same time, Adria 550, flying lower at 26,000 feet, contacts the middle sector controller for permission to climb.
Zagreb, flight 550, flight level 260, requesting higher.
Permission is granted by the middle sector controller, who passes the information to Tasic. It's now that the stress on Tasic shows. Overstretched, he's lost sight of the fact that a new plane is about to enter his airspace. All of a sudden, the Adria flight appears on his screen. He's caught completely by surprise.
The absence of a proper handover was tantamount to saying things are going to happen. The controller is on a nightmare scenario where an aircraft suddenly calls him, he doesn't know who it is, what it is, and if it is in conflict with another aircraft of his, he has no way of knowing.
Seconds later, the Adria and BA flights are closing on each other at a combined speed of over 1,000 miles per hour. Finally, Tasic realizes what's happening. Frantically, he tells the Adria flight to stop climbing.
Adria 550, descend immediately, flight level 30.
But it's too late. The Adria flight's co-pilot's last words are caught on the cockpit voice recorder.
We're finished! Goodbye! Goodbye!
3 seconds later, the two aircraft collide. Mladen Hochberger was one of the air traffic controllers that day.
After about 15 minutes, we heard people yelling, crash, crash, crash. It's difficult to describe. It's worse than someone telling you your wife has died in a car crash. The situation was terrible. It's impossible to describe. A nightmare, a real nightmare.
Wreckage from the two planes lands near the Yugoslav town of Vrbovec, 16 miles northeast of Zagreb. All 176 people in the two aircraft have died. In Croatia, flags are flown at half-mast. 6 air traffic controllers are arrested, including Hochberger. How could such a catastrophic collision have occurred?
Everybody was concerned about his or her own situation. What's going to happen to us? What's going to happen to our careers?
After 2 months in jail, Hochberger is released. But the upper sector man on duty, Gradimir Tasic, is sentenced to 7 years jail for failing to do his job.
It was horrible. We were all frightened. It's every controller's nightmare. It's not something that happens to a lot of people. Thank God.
But soon, a more complicated story emerges at the inquiry. It's clear Tasić was grossly overworked, and his sentence is halved. The air crews also come in for criticism. The BA co-pilot should not have been doing a crossword at the time. He should have been looking out for trouble. Most importantly, the inquiry argues the pressures of the job should be better recognized, and the working hours of air traffic controllers strictly limited.
In certain areas, people will not work more than 1.5 hours, and even if they exceed that, the general premise is that they should not work for more than 2 hours without a break.
The Zagreb disaster highlighted the two basic communication issues that contribute to collisions. One is visual. Pilots should be looking out for other traffic. The other is verbal. Tasić had simply not grasped the middle sector controller was trying to inform him that a handover was taking place. Neither of these issues is fully dealt with and will come back to haunt the world of aviation. As a result, there will be more aircraft collisions. The Canary Islands, one of the world's top holiday destinations. But one spring day, there's a problem. On March 27th, the island's main international airport on Las Palmas is shut by a bomb scare, and planes are being diverted to the tiny airport of Los Rodeos on Tenerife. One of these diverted planes is KLM Flight 4805 from Amsterdam, a 747 jumbo with over 200 passengers on board. Many are young families looking forward to a holiday in the sun. Another diverted plane is Pan Am Flight 1736 from Los Angeles via New York. It's another 747 jumbo. Most of the passengers are on their way to a much looked forward to cruise. But Los Rodeos is ill-equipped to handle the extra traffic. There's just a single runway and a parallel taxiway, with a number of smaller taxiways linking the two. As the aircraft wait to continue their journey, they're crammed haphazardly along the taxiway. On the Pan Am flight, it's been a long and exhausting journey. Dorothy Kelly was a junior purser on board the flight. She remembers trying to help her elderly passengers.
We spent at least 2 hours, I think, on the ground. People were tired, they were milling around, we didn't have much food left. We gave them what we could to find, to eat, to drink. They wanted information, and there was none available. We just didn't know what to tell them.
Finally, after 3 hours delay, the KLM flight is instructed to prepare for takeoff. The aircraft's captain is Jacob van Zanten. He's instructed to taxi up the main runway, turn around, and wait for clearance to take off. 4 minutes later, the Pan Am flight is told to follow suit. But the Pan Am pilot is instructed to turn off before the end of the runway and wait for the KLM flight to take off. Suddenly, fog descends on the airport. Bob Bragg was the co-pilot on the Pan Am flight. He remembers they had got about 1/3 of the way down the runway.
And a fog bank came off the southern group of hills, rolled down and stopped right on the runway. And the visibility went from unlimited to less than 500 meters.
With visibility this low, the two planes can't see each other. And the air traffic controllers can't see them either.
1320, taxi echo, backtrack and line up.
But as the KLM flight now maneuvers at the end of the runway, Captain Van Zanten is impatient to make up time. He orders his first officer to tell the control tower they're ready for takeoff.
Tenerife Control, this is KLM Flight 4805, requesting takeoff clearance, over.
What happens next is unclear. A record of the radio conversation between the control tower and the pilots seems to show the KLM first officer signing off with the words,
"We are now at takeoff."
Or does he really say, "We are now taking off"?
05.
Whichever it is, a recording from the cockpit voice recorder shows Van Zanten cuts across him.
We're going. We're going.
It's now there is a critical communication error. The Spanish controller replies, "Okay."
Okay.
Van Zanten takes it as permission to roll forward for takeoff. But it's a misunderstanding. The air traffic controller immediately adds, "Stand by for takeoff. I will call you." This second part of the message is lost in radio static, and Van Zanten doesn't appear to hear it. Meanwhile, invisible in the fog, the Pan Am flight is still on the runway.
The captain had the airplane slowed down to about 3 knots. And we were following the center line, just taxiing down the runway, but very slowly.
As the KLM Jumbo now gathers speed, it can't see the Pan Am 747 bang in front of it. Suddenly, the Pan Am crew see the lights of the KLM aircraft bearing down on them.
He was coming very quickly at us down the runway. It's the only time in my life that I have ever seen anything I didn't believe was happening.
The Pan Am crew apply full power.
Get up! Get up!
And take a sharp left turn off towards an exit. At the same time, on the KLM plane, Van Zanten desperately tries to lift off the ground. But it's too late.
I basically closed my eyes and ducked.
All of a sudden, I saw things flying around. I thought, oh my God, we've been bombed. Then everything started moving in slow motion.
Both aircraft had been ripped into pieces. Even those who'd been on the scene through the hours of darkness were shocked by the carnage.
The final death toll is 583 people. It's the biggest loss of life in aviation history.
The pictures can show this horror. They can't convey the stench of the dead, of the smouldering still of the two aircraft.
Well, I think we can safely state that this is one of the saddest days in our history.
Yet, incredibly, 55 people on the Pan Am flight survive. Among them are Dorothy Kelly and Bob Bragg.
think to yourself, why me? It took me probably 3 days to comprehend what had happened.
Dorothy Kelly survived with a black eye and head wounds, but is still emotionally marked by what happened to her.
It has changed my personal life. Anything can happen anytime to anybody. And it doesn't matter who you are surrounded by or how much money you have or how healthy you are or young you are, it can happen in a blink of an eye.
In the following months, there are many bitter lessons to be learned. The final inquiry attributes some of the blame to Van Zanten for not waiting for an unequivocal go-ahead to take off. But the most important legacy is sweeping changes to the language used by crews and controllers to communicate.
Daniel 183 heard radar. Say again your estimate for Ibsley.
The standard of your English has to be checked as competent.
Diamond 204, climb to flight level 8 today.
Not just in conversational, ordinary conversation, but in air traffic control, and particularly in areas where incidents take place out of the ordinary.
There's also a push to tighten up the terms and expressions used. Captain Chris Clark trains airline pilots.
Lots of the old expressions like OK and Roger were discontinued and banned.
From now on, controllers must use the phrase line up and wait as an instruction to aircraft moving into position on the runway.
Now before this, he may have been told just line up or OK or enter the runway. And those terminologies are open to some misunderstanding, particularly if the English is a little bit poor.
Finally, the phrase take off should only be used when the final takeoff clearance is given.
It used to be that the pilot, when they were ready to take off, would say to ATC the phrase, ready for takeoff. That was changed to say, ready for departure, so that the actual word takeoff was only ever used by the ground station when they said, clear for takeoff.
By the late 1970s, verbal communications between pilots and air traffic controllers have significantly improved. But this is only solving part of the problem. Another clear lesson from Zagreb and Tenerife is that to avoid collisions, pilots need to look out for each other. But it's a lesson never properly learned. It was the failure of the pilots to see each other that leads to the disaster at Los Angeles Airport in August 1986. At 11:42, Aero Mexico Flight 498 collides with a light aircraft and crashes into the suburb of Cerritos. All 67 people on both planes die. 5 homes are destroyed, and 15 people on the ground are also killed. Mary Misrock is waiting for her husband and 3 children to return from a holiday in Mexico.
So I was waiting in the international terminal and waited and waited. You know, it was way after the time that they should have showed up.
Finally, she is told to go to another part of the airport.
When I got in the elevator, I just knew that the plane had crashed. For some reason, I mean, there was no other reason other than I just had a feeling. All the bad things go through your mind. It was surreal. It's just surreal.
The devastation is so total, it's hard to identify the victims.
My husband was not identified for a couple of weeks.
The way that the plane came straight down, most of the bodies were basically disintegrated. It was hard for us to decipher if it was actually part of a person or not.
The deadly accident at last drives home the message that you can't rely on pilots to see each other. There are just too many distractions. As a direct consequence, during the 1980s, the accident leads to the widespread introduction of an extraordinarily clever piece of new technology. It's called TCAS, the Traffic Collision and Avoidance System. TCAS relies on a clever piece of technology called a transponder, a device that both transmits and responds to radio signals. When two aircraft approach each other, their transponders lock on and start to talk to each other. Terry McHattie trains pilots to use TCAS.
The transponders of these aircraft interrogate each other many times a second, and in so doing create a three-dimensional radio bubble around each aircraft. If at any time it senses those two bubbles may come to be too close for comfort, TCAS will generate various warnings to which pilots must react.
An approaching plane will show up as a white diamond.
And as you can see, we've got traffic here below us, but climbing as indicated by the arrow. It's now 600 feet below us.
The radio bubbles are too close for comfort. The white diamond changes to an orange circle, and TCAS flashes up a warning.
Traffic, traffic.
Okay, that's now a traffic advisory, 500 feet below us and still climbing.
If the situation gets serious, the orange circle becomes a red square, and TCAS orders the plane to change course.
Climb, climb.
Okay,
climb.
It's now a resolutionary advisory, so I need to maneuver the aircraft to avoid the traffic.
In this simulation, TCAS orders one plane to climb, the other to descend.
Maintain vertical speed. Maintain vertical speed.
TCAS has steered the aircraft away from each other.
Clear of conflict. Clear of conflict.
Clear of conflict. Re-engaging the autopilot. And the two bubbles in which their aircraft are sitting will move to a safe distance apart once more.
Technology seems to have finally solved the problem of pilots not being able to see each other. As a direct result of the LA collision, TCAS is now compulsory on all commercial aircraft flying to most destinations. But the TCAS system, designed to make collisions almost impossible, would one day play a part in one of the worst collisions of modern times. Moscow, and a Bashkirian Airlines charter flight takes off for Barcelona, Spain. On board are 45 children from the Russian city of Ufa. The children have all been chosen for their outstanding artistic, academic, or sporting ability. These are among the best and brightest Russia has to offer. 11-year-old Artur Kamatov is a straight-A star pupil. His proud father, Zulfat, talked to him just before takeoff.
His voice was positively singing. He was happy. He said, "Dad, we're boarding the plane, we're flying away soon, everything's fine." He told us not to worry, and we said goodbye.
15-year-old Linara Kishmatulin is planning to be an economist.
Linara was my eldest daughter. She was very happy during the days before the trip. She was getting ready for new experiences.
Also on board are Svetlana Kaloyev and her two children, Konstantin and Diana. They are looking forward to seeing their father, Vitaly, who is working in Spain.
I had practically finished my contract, and my wife and I decided I would wait for them to join me, so they could get some rest on swimming. We were just waiting for the children to finish school so that the holiday could begin.
But also in the sky that day, there is a 757 cargo plane.
611, request climb flight level 360.
DHL Flight 611 is en route from Bergamo in Italy to Brussels. The plane with the children on board is approaching from the east. The two planes' flight plans will cross somewhere near Zurich. In the Zurich Air Traffic Control Center, the man responsible for their safety is Peter Nielsen.
Number 1943 X-ray.
He has a battery of modern technology at his disposal. But maintenance work has temporarily knocked out the collision warning system and some of his telephone lines. That evening, he's also the only controller on duty. At around 9 o'clock in the evening, the DHL cargo plane approaches Swiss airspace. Its British captain asks Nielsen for permission to climb through 36,000 feet.
DHL 611, request climb flight level 360.
Nielsen gives him the go-ahead.
Dallas 611 Zurich Center, climb maintain, flight level 360.
Minutes later, the Bashkirian Airlines flight also calls in. It's already cruising at 36,000 feet.
Radar contact.
Just as Nielsen takes the call, a third plane radios for help. Nielsen is now juggling 3 aircraft. Then a fourth plane calls in. Nielsen is under huge pressure. With nobody to help him, he constantly moves between 2 workstations. Bob Trott, an experienced air traffic controller, has faced similar pressures.
Pressures would have been unbelievably high. He was using equipment which was not completely serviceable. He was operating 2 sectors where normally there's 1 person per sector. So he literally had to run around between 2 different radar displays trying to sort out the aircraft involved.
Of course, none of this is known to the children on the Russian plane. But as they approach Zurich, their aircraft is on a collision course with the DHL cargo plane. Even so, at this point, there's no cause for alarm.
What's he showing? You see anything out
There's still plenty of time to take avoiding action. But then, something goes wrong. The 2 planes continue to head for each other. At 9:35 p.m. local time, they collide.
Burning debris litters the fields along the shore of Lake Constance. The wreckage fell towards the ground at a rate of hundreds of miles an hour, slamming into the soil, just seconds after the 2 jets collided in mid-air.
The wreckage is scattered across a 4-mile area near the Swiss-German border. All 71 people in both planes die. The bodies of many of the children are unrecognizable.
Those were the minutes when our lives turned upside down. I didn't want to believe it, although I immediately realized that this was our plane and our children. Nevertheless, there was some sort of hope of them being alive, because we simply couldn't believe the children had died.
Невозможно было поверить, что дети погибли.
Today, in the Russian town of Ufa, there's a memorial to the children in the city's cemetery. It's part Muslim, part Christian. Zulfat Kamatov lost his academically gifted son, 11-year-old Artur. He's still in shock.
И сейчас нам не верится, что они погибли.
Even now, we still can't believe they're dead. We live in the anticipation that they have gone somewhere and will return someday. And it will probably feel this way for as long as we live. We barely saw their bodies, so to us, they're still alive.
Batir Kishmatulin lost his 15-year-old daughter, Linara. She was hoping to study economics.
I used to think that I'd begin to forget, but I still hear her voice in my ears. And how she said, Papa. All of this is forever and unforgettable.
At the crash site, there's a puzzle the investigators need to solve. With each plane equipped with TCAS, how could the collision have occurred? Slowly, they piece together an extraordinary story of misunderstanding. As the two aircraft drew close on that fateful evening, the TCAS instruments on both planes locked onto each other by radio. On board the Bashkirian flight, TCAS told the Russians to climb.
Climb.
At almost the same moment, the DHL system ordered a descent.
Descend.
The system was working just as it was meant to, and the planes should now move apart. But then, suddenly, the air traffic controller in Zurich, Peter Nielsen, working alone and still juggling too many planes, caught up with what was going on. He could see on his radar the two planes approaching each other. Unaware the anti-collision systems had kicked in, he ordered the Russians to descend, directly contrary to what TCAS had ordered.
Passenger 2973, descend, expedite.
The Russian crew face a dilemma. Should they obey the machine and climb, or the controller and descend?
The Russian pilots, for all of their previous experience, they were duty-bound, morally bound, felt bound to follow the air traffic controller's advice. Probably this was the first time that they had ever been faced with a conflict where their common sense and their experience told them to follow the air traffic controller, and their aeroplane was telling them to do the opposite.
The Russian captain ordered a descent. Meanwhile, the DHL plane, obeying TCAS, also descended. The two planes fly straight into each other. The final German crash report blames the Zurich Air Traffic Control Company for poor management. Maintenance work should never have been allowed to interfere with the function of the air traffic control equipment. Nor should Peter Nielsen have been working alone. 4 company executives are found guilty of manslaughter. But the most important finding is more fundamental. The report starkly highlights the fact that while TCAS has replaced the need for pilots to look out for each other, nobody has ever resolved what happens when there is a conflict between TCAS and a controller. In the future, to avoid collisions, all pilots are told to obey TCAS, no matter what the controller says.
The worldwide opinion now, right across the industry, is that if you get a TCAS warning, you must follow that. It was absolutely drummed into all of our pilots now that that is the first corrective action you take.
As a result of the Zurich collision, such calamities should be avoidable in the future. But for one man, all this is irrelevant. Vitaly Kaloyev has lost his wife and 2 children on that same plane. He's the first of the relatives to reach the crash site. The experience is traumatic.
As I drove up to the headquarters of the rescue operation, I saw the bodies of children lying near the road. I went into shock when I saw those bodies torn apart. For about half an hour, I couldn't move my arms or my legs.
Kaloyev insists on being allowed to take part in the search for bodies.
My little girl was probably identified first because she was the smallest body, the smallest one. When they showed me where the plane had fallen, there was a big tree there. She'd probably fallen into the tree, and the branches had helped break her fall a little. I saw at once that some of her hair had become stuck in the tree. I took it down. Then I put my hands on the spot on the ground where she'd fallen. I stroked it and felt some objects. I picked them out, and it was the beads she'd worn around her neck.
Back in his hometown of Vladikavkaz, the horror starts to fester. He wants justice. In its place, the Swiss air traffic control company offer compensation. But Kaloyev doesn't want money. He wants somebody to take responsibility for what's happened. And he wants an apology. For 2 years, he waits for somebody to say sorry. Finally, he loses patience.
They kept me dangling and refused my requests, so I said, okay, wait for me. I'm coming without invitation.
2 years after the disaster, he returns to Zurich. Somebody is going to pay for the death of his family. He checks into a hotel close to the home of the air traffic controller, Peter Nielsen. He's brought with him pictures of his children. And he's also brought a knife. On February the 24th, he pays Nielsen a visit. He tries to show Nielsen his family pictures. But Nielsen, thoroughly alarmed, brushes them away. An argument breaks out. Kaloyev loses control.
Yesterday night at about 6:30, one of our air traffic controllers has been killed in his home.
Kaloyev serves 3 years in a Swiss jail for murder and is then released.
First of all, I'll go home, and then I will visit the graveyard of my children.
Today, he's back in Vladikavkaz, where he's regarded by many as a hero. The story of what Vitaly Kaloyev did to Peter Nielsen was a shocking one. It brings home just how great the human cost of aircraft collisions can be. But from disasters like these, there are positive outcomes. Communication between air traffic controllers and pilots has dramatically improved. The battery of new and clever technologies have made flying safer than ever before. The management of air traffic is better and more carefully regulated. Near misses should now remain just that, misses. Yet when humans interact with machines, there is always the danger of mistakes. The battle to avoid new collisions in the future will go on. Passengers are at life and death risk when planes are badly built.
Hydraulics? We've lost it!
When engineers make mistakes.
This tragedy is not an accident.
Seconds after takeoff, this plane flips out of control.
This broke every rule in the book.
Hidden errors destroy this jumbo jet. Every crash holds lessons that cannot be ignored.
Somebody's got to stand up and say, come on, people, let's do the right thing.
But some engineering solutions can lead to further unexpected problems. How does the aviation industry battle to eliminate engineering error? JFK Airport, New York. It's the end of a hot July day. TWA Flight 800 is waiting to depart for Paris.
Oxygen mask, goggles, and intercom.
It finally takes off just after 8 o'clock in the evening. There are 230 people on board. Among them, Jill Zimkovits is on her first overseas trip as flight attendant. Jill's brother, Matt, air safety campaigner.
It was, it was a regular day, it was a beautiful day, and Jill was so excited about flying to France that she was told everybody that she was doing it.
In Jill's care is a group of 16 high school students from a small town in Pennsylvania. They're off to see the sights of Paris on the biggest journey of their lives. As they settle in, the plane climbs up towards its cruising height. "14,000 feet above the Atlantic, TWA 800 and everyone on board is blown out of the sky. The plane's last moments were seen by hundreds of eyewitnesses.
We saw a big giant ball of flames, biggest orange ball I ever saw.
My son was standing there on the beach and he said, "Oh, look," and we saw an explosion. We turned and looked at what looked like fireworks that were in the sky.
And I looked up and I saw what appeared to be a glowing ball.
Jill's brother Matt remembers that dreadful evening.
all of a sudden, we got word that there was a plane crash off of the coast of Long Island. The details were sketchy, and my mom was the first to hear. And I remember her curled up on the couch, and she knew. She knew there was no hope. It started connecting that this was Jill's flight. This was, TWA Flight 800. It happened.
Flight attendant Jill's body is one of the first to be recovered. All 230 people on board the Boeing 747 are dead. Following the eyewitness reports, many suspect the plane was brought down by a missile or a bomb. The FBI tell the public it's terrorism.
We know there was a catastrophic explosion. It's caused by some sort of a bomb, obviously. We're not further describing where that would be, whether it was carried on or something hit the plane from outside and caused it to explode.
But the crash investigators need to be sure. They have a difficult, delicate task. First, they have to remove the victims' bodies. Then recover thousands of pieces of wreckage. Each one a potential clue. At 100 feet down, each diver can only work for a short time. After 7 days searching, they find the plane's black boxes.
Excuse us.
Immediately, the investigators' hopes rise. Both voice and data recorders have survived the impact.
About 11.5 minutes after takeoff, the recording ended abruptly.
That abrupt stop is a clear indication of a catastrophic event, but that was all the investigators could tell. The recorders appear to hold no further clues. To find out what happened to TWA 800, the crash investigators begin the painstaking task of reassembling key parts of the jumbo jet. An extraordinary 95% of the plane has been recovered. And soon, they can come to one definite conclusion. TWA 800 was not brought down by terrorists. Jim Wildey was the team's materials expert.
It became pretty clear within the first month of the investigation, and even maybe sooner than that of all the pieces that were being recovered, not one single piece contained any evidence of a bomb or a missile.
But now there's a new puzzle. If it wasn't terrorism, what has gone wrong with this plane? Investigators start the long process to establish the cause of the crash. Is it possible that a plane designed to be fail-safe could be the victim of engineering error? It's one of the man-made catastrophes of the modern world. Hundreds of lives lost, billions of dollars wasted because a plane's not fit to fly, because of engineering error. But the need for safety has always vied with the need to make money. The boom in air travel triggers a boom in aircraft construction. And competition is fierce. Lockheed Martin, McDonnell Douglas, and the Boeing Corporation, all vying for the top spot. In 1970, McDonnell Douglas unveils its new star, the DC-10. After $1 billion investment, they're convinced it's both safe and a future moneymaker.
The first was the great DC-10, flying with pride.
The DC-10 seems to be beautifully made. It handles well and is immediately popular with pilots. John Baines, DC-10 captain and former RAF fighter pilot.
It's a huge aeroplane. You think it would be heavy to fly. It isn't. It's very light and delightful and fairly simple. I found it my favorite aircraft that I ever flew.
Carrying over 250 passengers, the DC-10 is one of the new generation of big jets. Its major rival is Boeing's 747 Jumbo, but the DC-10 can use much shorter runways.
American 340, turn right to 070, start descent as soon as feasible, call departure.
Roger, ready to go.
Bye-bye.
The DC-10 appears to be a winner for McDonnell Douglas. Within 3 years, it's flying the busiest routes across America. But then, disaster strikes through engineering error. Springtime in Paris. At Orly Airport, father of 5, Francois Drouin, is setting off on a business trip. His son Bruno was then just 5 years old.
I remember that Sunday that we drove our father to Orly. My father was taking a plane to London for his job. He was working for an oil company.
But Bruno's father's flight from Orly Airport has been cancelled because of a strike on a British airline. One of the only planes available is Turkish Airlines Flight 981, just arrived from Istanbul and on its way to London. It's a DC-10, just 2 years old.
Because of this unexpected strike, many people took that plane. And so for that reason, this plane was full.
The Turkish Airlines DC-10 is held in Paris, so it can take on passengers stranded by the strike. Unknown to his family, Francois Drouin also gets on board. Captains Ulusman and Burkos complete their pre-flight checks. At the back of the plane, Mohammed Mahmoudi, baggage loader, closes the cargo door. The DC-10 is finally ready to leave for London. Flight 981 is cleared for takeoff just after 12:30 in the afternoon. Everything appears normal. Until the plane approaches 12,000 feet.
What was that?
Gusts of cold air rip past the passengers.
Cabin blew out. I can bring it up. She's not responding. Hydraulics? We've lost it. Feet.
Just outside Paris, the plane smashes into the ground at almost 500 miles an hour. All 346 passengers and crew are killed.
It was a very, very violent impact. And the French authority as well were not prepared for such an event. It was the first one.
Bruno's family fear the worst for their father, but they still don't know whether he'd switched planes.
The passenger manifest was not complete, so when it happened, they couldn't get clear information. The proof of my father's presence in this plane was identified through his wedding ring that had been found on a fragment of his hand, and in which it was the date of the wedding of my parents and the first name of my mother.
Bruno was just one of many children who lost a parent.
So it had an impact on me, but also on people around me. I didn't know when my first child came how a father is behaving, because I didn't see it.
In the aftermath, the French investigators begin the dreadful process of looking for clues amongst the wreckage.
People who had to work there, all of them had tremendous shock. Many of them reported that they couldn't do it so much or so long because it was emotionally difficult. A lot of human fragments, almost everywhere.
But then the investigators get their first major clue. 10 miles from where the plane came down, French police discover a macabre scene. 6 dead passengers strapped into 2 rows of seats. Alongside them, a mangled piece of wreckage. It turns out to be the rear cargo door. The same door that had been closed just a few minutes earlier by baggage loader Mohammed Mahmoudi. But how could a door just fall off a plane? The answer would turn out to be engineering error. The investigators now focus on the issue of pressurization. Jet aircraft fly at high altitude, where the air pressure is very low. To keep the passengers comfortable, the interior of the plane has to be kept at a higher pressure.
If the cabin was not pressurized, the passengers would be exposed to an altitude higher than Mount Everest.
So it's crucial the DC-10's doors are designed to be airtight. During flight, the pressurized air inside the plane is pushing against the doors, trying to force them open. The large cargo doors which open outwards are particularly vulnerable. David Learmount is a pilot and an expert on aviation issues.
These doors, of course, are very large. You know, they're very, very large doors indeed. So if they open in flight, you've got a hell of a big hole in the aeroplane.
To prevent the cargo doors being blown open, the DC-10's engineers designed an elaborate locking mechanism. Pushing an external lever rotates claws on the inside, so they catch around a bar. It should have been totally reliable, but it was not.
The design fault was this. You could actually operate the lever, and it felt as if it had locked, but it could have failed to lock completely.
Investigators find that the door lever could appear to be properly closed, even though the locking claws were not being held in place. It's a clear example of engineering error. The investigators start to piece together an horrific chain of events. It all starts with the door's failing locking mechanism.
basically they were doomed from that moment on, because when the cargo door blew out, all of the air in the cargo hold beneath the cabin floor exited this very, very large hole.
The blowing out of the cargo door was the first disaster. Then the pressurized air in the cabin also tries to escape to the outside, smashing a hole in the cabin floor. It's this violent rush of air which sweeps 6 passengers out of the plane to their deaths. Those were the 6 people found 10 miles from the main crash site, still strapped to their seats. The collapsing cabin floor leads to a further disaster. It destroys vital control cables.
Hydraulics? We lost it!
These cables work with hydraulic pressure to move critical parts, like the rudder and stabilizers. Without them, the pilots are unable to fly the plane.
I can bring it up. She's not responding.
So the pilots had no control over the airplane any longer. They literally couldn't tell the airplane any longer what to do. The equivalent in a car would be your steering and your brakes fail. There's nothing you can do. You can't direct the car, and you can't slow it down.
Years later, in memory of all those who died, Bruno wants to find out the full story behind the crash that killed his father. From all the available evidence, it's clear to him that this wasn't an accident. It was caused by engineering error.
For me, this tragedy is not an accident. Accidents, it's bad luck. Here we are in something else. It had been a combination of bad luck, but with absolutely a known problem.
Bruno finds out from an internal memo that even some of the engineers who built the DC-10's cargo doors thought they were unsafe.
The product manager regarding the locking of the door made a report mentioning that this locking system was not very safe, and it was a risk that in the life of the plane, almost 20 years, some loss of planes and people. It's gonna happen.
Then Bruno learns that an American DC-10 had suffered exactly the same engineering error 2 years before his father died. The door blew out, the cabin floor collapsed, and vital control cables were damaged. But the pilots got lucky.
It crimped the control cables, but it didn't cut them, and the pilots were able to nurse the aircraft back to a safe landing.
So Bruno's father and his fellow victims didn't die just because of an engineering error. They died because of a known engineering error that no one had prevented. Eventually, the authorities act. All DC-10 cargo doors are fitted with a new lock, and vents put in the cabin floor to stop it collapsing. But not all the lessons were heeded. It was the destruction of the plane's control system that had brought the DC-10 down. For the future, it had to be made fail-safe, so that even if one part suffered a catastrophic failure, the plane should still be safe to fly. But 5 years later, that failure to make it fail-safe would come back to haunt the makers of the DC-10, McDonnell Douglas. Chicago's O'Hare Airport.
United 562, turn right, heading 070, call departure, good day.
The busiest in the world.
He needs to make a right turn where you're at. Can you make a left turn in there?
On that day in 1979, it's even busier than usual.
Military off his right side to go across.
Yeah, I'm trying to get everybody out of here.
It's the start of the Memorial Day weekend, and tens of thousands of passengers are trying to get airborne.
Takeoff lap selector is set 5. Is complete.
An American Airlines DC-10 prepares to set off for Los Angeles.
0, set and custom. O'Hare ground, United American 191 for taxi.
And line 03, taxi on position, hold on runway 32 left from T1.
Make a left turn in there.
At 2 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, the DC-10 is ready to go.
Engine stable, takeoff thrust.
Powered by its 3 engines, the plane hurtles down the runway.
V2. Positive climb, gear up.
Suddenly, the left engine breaks loose.
Damn.
Yeah, that airplane just lost the engine here.
It sounds catastrophic, but even losing an engine shouldn't have brought the plane down. DC-10s were designed to be able to fly on 2 engines. But then the plane starts to bank to the left.
Oh my God!
Something else has gone wrong. The pilots lose control. The DC-10 flips right over. All 271 on board are killed, as well as 2 people on the ground. It is the worst single aviation accident in US history. There are now 2 big questions. Why had the engine fallen off? And why had a plane designed to fly on just 2 engines flipped over out of control? Answering why the DC-10's engine fell off proves alarmingly simple. It's a case of poor maintenance. One of the attachments holding the engines in place had been cracked, and no one had noticed. Urgent checks reveal similar cracks in 6 other DC-10s. The concern is the entire fleet in America is now at risk. That's a frightening 138 aircraft.
I have no choice but to ground all U.S. DC-10s immediately.
The blame for the cracks falls on the airlines, not on the plane's manufacturers, McDonnell Douglas. But then the investigators discover another critical error. And that error has to do with fail-safe design. The idea that if there's a catastrophic failure, the pilot should still be able to control the plane. It all goes back to the moment when the plane banks to the left. That happens because the engine coming off ruptures vital hydraulic control lines, operating slats on the wings.
When the engine tore itself away from the wing, it destroyed the hydraulic system which kept those slats extended. When the slats retracted, because they had no longer hydraulic pressure to keep them out, that wing lost lift.
Just like in the Turkish Airlines incident, the plane crashes because pilots lose control. The lesson of fail-safe construction has not been learned.
That is not in the best traditions of aircraft design. Aircraft design is supposed to be based on what they call fail-safe. If it fails, the aircraft's still safe. This broke every rule in the book.
Over the next few years, the DC-10's engineers do learn this lesson. They install mechanical systems to make the DC-10 safe. But they can't patch up the plane's damaged reputation. Today's DC-10s are mainly used as cargo planes. It is Boeing's 747 Jumbo that becomes the world's most successful passenger jet. Its engineers seem to have learned the lessons of fail-safe design. Until that July evening in 1996, when TWA Flight 800 blows up, killing all 230 passengers and crew. After months of painstaking work, the crash investigators have reassembled entire sections of the shattered plane.
With all the large number of pieces, thousands of pieces, they had to be pieced back together so that we could start to understand how the airplane came apart and then try to focus on why the airplane might have come apart.
Once they'd ruled out the possibility of a missile or a bomb, they searched for the source of the explosion in the plane itself. Eventually, they find it. The central fuel tank has blown up. So what had done it? It didn't take long to identify the culprit. It was right there in the tank. Fuel vapor. When Boeing's engineers designed the 747 in the 1960s, the plane was expected to fly with all its tanks full. But when fuel prices rose, the airlines had to cut their costs. Christine Negroni has written extensively about TWA 800.
As we started to get more concerned about our use of fuel in the 70s and the 80s, airplanes stopped flying with full fuel tanks. If they didn't need the fuel, the tank went empty.
But investigators discovered that flying with empty fuel tanks posed a risk that had not been fully recognized. On that July afternoon, TWA 800 is sitting out in the baking heat at JFK Airport. To keep costs down, its central tank has just a puddle of fuel in it. And when that fuel gets hot, it turns into explosive vapor. This situation is made far worse by a second engineering error. Directly beneath the fuel tank, Boeing's engineers have put the plane's air handling units. These provide filtered air into the passenger cabin. But while they're making the passengers comfortable, these units are also giving off heat. And that heat is going straight into the fuel tank.
All there is a puddle, and that puddle turned to vapor, and the vapor was explosive.
The investigators now uncover a terrifying scenario. TWA 800 is climbing away from New York with a highly explosive fuel tank. The 230 people on board have no idea. It's like sitting above a bomb waiting to detonate. All it needs is a spark to set it off. But that's a risk Boeing's engineers thought they had eliminated. Their fail-safe design should have prevented it. They had made sure the only wiring allowed in the tank used a very low voltage. Not enough to cause the spark. Bob Swaim is a key member of the investigation team. He begins his hunt for the cause of the spark by taking another look at the cockpit voice recorder.
We came to realize that some of the background noise dropped out. Well, the energy didn't just disappear, it went somewhere.
Where the energy went was a short circuit, somewhere in the plane's wiring. And short circuits can cause sparks. But Bob Swaim's still puzzled. There's only low voltage wiring in the fuel tank. Even a short circuit shouldn't have been powerful enough to create the deadly spark. Looking for an explanation, Swaim and his team sift through the vast extent of the plane's wiring.
We examined 150 miles of wire from this one airplane, inch by inch. We would sit there on stools or whatever we could find, like little old ladies in a knitting circle, looking at wiring.
What they find is some of that wiring is in a terrible state. And many different wires with cracked insulation are bundled together.
And this was really important because you could have wires that were powering electric lights with over 150 volts, laying next to wires that would go to a fuel tank, which should never have more than 5 volts.
Swaim now realizes if the high voltage wiring is damaged, a dangerously high current could jump across into the tank's electrical system, causing the fatal spark. The investigation finally pieces together the sequence of engineering errors that brought down TWA 800. First, fuel vapor builds up in the tank. It's heated to a critical state by the air handling units. Cracked wires allow high voltage current into the tank. There's a short circuit, a spark, and the tragic result is the second worst domestic air disaster in America. Every year, families and friends meet to remember their loved ones killed on board TWA 800.
It ruined the family. It's not the same as it was. There's always something missing. But when it's coming to safety and human life and people's lives and potentially your children's lives, you can't put a price tag on that. And I think it's not so hard to do the right thing. And sometimes I think the airlines and industry and the engineers get wrapped up in statistics and numbers, and they lose the connection with people.
But there is some compensation. Flight attendant Jill Zimkowitz and her fellow victims didn't die in vain. The authorities finally recognized the threat of exploding fuel tanks. With 1,200 other jumbo jets at risk around the world, they had to come up with a solution. New technology now replaces explosive vapor in the fuel tank with the inert gas nitrogen.
Overall, other than complaining about the slow pace at which safety changes are made in aviation, I'd have to say Flight 800 has a good legacy.
The TWA 800 investigation shows that a plane can have an excellent safety record until circumstances change. In the case of Flight 800, Flying with an empty fuel tank exposes unforeseen risks in the plane's design. Aircraft engineers realize they have to get better at predicting problems.
The type of engineering issue which happens now in a good airline with a modern aeroplane is the type of engineering issue that has not been foreseen.
But is this going to be possible? In the 1990s, to minimize engineering error, Boeing begins using the very latest technology to design and build the 777, the world's largest twin-engine jet. Just like Boeing's original Jumbo, it soon gains an impressive reputation for safety. David Kaminsky-Morrow is an expert on aviation safety.
It'll be 13 years up to January 2008. This aircraft had clocked up 14 million flight hours without a single one being lost in an accident.
But there is a shock in store for Boeing's engineers. They may have dealt with the risks of fuel getting too hot, but they will fail to predict what can happen when fuel gets too cold. Heathrow Airport on a normal busy day. Planes from all over the world landing every 3 minutes on the southern runway. Among those on its way into Heathrow is a British Airways 777. Flight 38 has 136 passengers and 16 crew on board. They've been flying for 11 hours through the night from Beijing, and everyone is looking forward to the end of the journey. Captain Peter Burkill and First Officer John Coward prepare for landing.
Okay, you have control, John.
I have control.
Everything is pretty much normal about a minute before the aircraft is due to touch down. It's at about 1,000 feet, the landing gear is down, the flaps are deployed at about 30 degrees. There's no indication there's anything wrong.
Speedbird 38, clear to land, 27 left.
Clear to land, 27 left, Speedbird 38.
Then at about 500 feet, just 35 seconds from landing,
I can't get power.
Both engines suddenly lose power.
The airspeed is starting to drop back. This 200-ton aeroplane is effectively turning into a glider.
The passengers have no idea they could be about to die. And it could be even worse. Beneath them, there are tens of thousands of people at risk. Cab driver Johnny Rowland is on his way to pick up a passenger when the plane flies right above him.
It was a noise that I hadn't heard before. It was a whistling noise rather than an engine noise. Just as I got to this point here, the cab completely went dark with a shadow around the whole area. And as I looked out the right-hand window, I saw the plane was so low to the fence, it could have only been 10 foot above the fence. And I said to myself, oh, you're going to crash.
Mayday, mayday, Speedbird.
Incredibly, all the passengers and crew survived the crash, with just a few minor injuries. The headlines are full of praise for the heroes in the cockpit.
As captain of the aircraft, I am proud to say that every member of my team played their part expertly yesterday, displaying the highest standards of skill and professionalism.
The engineers are now desperate to find out why those two engines lost power. A double engine failure is extremely rare. Soon the plane's data recorders point them towards a very new kind of engineering problem. Something stopped fuel flowing to the engines. But what?
Something happened within the fuel system which had never been foreseen.
Back at their base, the investigators reassemble the plane's system of fuel pipes, but they can't find any physical obstruction. That leaves one other possibility: ice. The plane's route from Beijing took it through some extremely cold air, down to -74 degrees Celsius. At these temperatures, the minute amount of water contained in aviation fuel can turn to crystals of ice. Had ice blocked the flow of fuel? At first, this seemed impossible. Ice is a well-known risk, and aircraft engineers thought they'd dealt with it. In the 777, they had made sure cold fuel is warmed up before it gets to the engine, in a device known as a heat exchanger. Steve Moss is a leading crash investigator and engine expert.
As the fuel flows through these tubes, it is heated so that as it comes out at the end here, it is actually above 0 degrees, so that ice crystals are not fed down to the engine.
So if this device was meant to melt any ice crystals, how could they have blocked the flow of fuel? The investigators then go back to the flight data recorders. They study what was happening in the fuel system during the long flight from Beijing. They then simulate the impact of cold weather on the fuel pipes.
Well, the testing showed something which had not been taken into account. During cruise, when the fuel flow is pretty sluggish, ice can actually accumulate inside the pipes.
So during the long journey, the investigators now think ice gradually builds up.
Okay, you have control, John.
I have control.
Approaching Heathrow, the pilots need more power from the engines. This sends a sudden surge of fuel through the pipes, dislodging the ice.
And it becomes a sort of snowball, or more likely an avalanche, getting bigger and bigger as it travels towards the engine.
The snowball smashes into the heat exchanger and blocks it. Just as the plane needs more power, the fuel can't get past the ice. The engines are useless.
Designers thought they'd thought of everything, but there was one circumstance they didn't even know could happen, and it's that.
Once again, it had taken a crash to reveal a problem the engineers had not foreseen. Now they know it can happen. It takes a very small alteration to the face of the heat exchanger to make sure even a sudden rush of ice can be melted. So what happened to BA Flight 38 is another stark reminder. It is the same lesson first revealed in the DC-10 crashes over 30 years before. Engineers have to plan for the unpredictable. They have to make the planes fail-safe. Today's engineers continue to strive to build much safer planes, and there are far fewer accidents due to engineering error.
Fatal accidents are 6 times rarer than they used to be 30 years ago. I mean, that is a quantifiable improvement. Massively improved reliability, engines, airframes, systems, but also we've been learning lessons.
The aviation industry is still young. Barely a century separates our modern jets from the first days of flight. For today's engineers, the challenge remains the same: to eliminate errors before they lead to disaster.